Thank you, Mike. Well, it is something that I think that is interesting to this medical center, and that we can pretty much say that this field did develop here. Sometimes I have mixed feelings about it. It was a little more peaceful when nobody else was particularly interested in it, and I could just sort of do what I wanted to do. And now, of course, it's a widely used technology. It's about the only thing in heart surgery that's expanding. There's been something like 50,000 of these pumps implanted worldwide. I know in 2000 there were only myself and George Noon that had put continuous flow blood pumps in, and now there's something like 600 surgeons around the world. So it is something you need to know something about, and particularly this continuous flow surgery. You have to be aware that everything that we've done in surgery has been a copy of the natural physiology, in that we have made an artificial valve that was a little better than the disease valves. We've done coronary bypasses to restore circulation to normal, and all of the pacemakers are based on the normal physiology. The pulsal pumps were all based on normal physiology. They were 1/3 systole, 2/3 diastole, et cetera, et cetera. But continuous flow pumps are a totally different physiology, and they're the only thing that is different as far as technologies that have been developed. So we still have a lot to learn about the physiology and the effects of the physiology. But the pump problem we've solved, so we'll get that out at the start. And we need I'm sure you get all of this. I actually started doing heart transplants in July of '82. We got cyclosporin. The guys at Stanford did one. Pittsburgh guys did one. We had the world expert on cyclosporin in the U.S. was Barry Cahan. So we did the third with cyclosporin. I asked Dr. Cooley if he wanted to come in and help me do it, since I'd never done one. And he said, well, he'd help me do one, but that's it. Because he didn't think they were worth anything. He'd done more than anyone in the first era of heart transplants. The cardiologists hated him because they were sick all the time and they couldn't bill for them. So, and he came in and he helped me. It was on July the 4th, 1982, and we did the first one here, and Dr. Cooley been to a little party. You know, he's a good Irishman. He had a little bit too much to drink probably, and he came in and he was grumpy, and he's very seldom grumpy, but he was grumpy. And he started sewing the heart in, and he was grumbling, and George Rule was there, and he was one of my mentors, Ross's father. And George was looking, I knew something was right, and I didn't know what it was wrong, rather, and I didn't know exactly what it was. And George said, Dr. Cooley, you're sewing the right atrium to the left atrium. And he said, oh, God damn. Well, see how easy that was, bud? See, you got to get it lined up. I just did that to show you how easy it was. So. Anyway, that's the only one he ever helped me with. And we've done over 1,400 at St. Luke's since then. Of course, the things have changed a bit in transplant. We're transplanting older patients. The donor problem, particularly in Europe, is very bad. You know, they're taking donors in their 40s. When we started out, we only took donors that were under 30. This is one of the most discouraging things about heart transplants is this slope has not changed since the 80s. So we have the same sort of fallout that we had. Cyclosporin was a huge advance in the treatment, the calcineurin inhibitors. But it is very discouraging because there's a limited lifespan to the transplants. Now, I was looking at the patients under 40 that I did between 82 and 92. It did 138 under 40, and there were 36 still living. And of the children that we did under 16, there's one, Uno. And but this is a picture in 1987. We were still a little more enthused. We had the youngest heart transplant in the world and the oldest. The only two in the picture that didn't have a heart transplant are myself and Dr. Cooley. And this is the young man that I just referred to that's still alive. He's had 3 heart transplants, but he's still alive and doing well. This little girl we did was the youngest in the world when we did her. She was 5 months old, and she died when she was 13 of coronary occlusion. So, and this man is the 3rd oldest survivor of a heart transplant. He's 32 years, and he just died recently of malignancy. He never rejected. His donor, I remember in the early days, I would go get the donor and then bring it back and do the transplant. And I flew over to San Antonio to get this guy's donor. And the donor was a long, skinny, red-headed kid, freckled, big feet, big hands. And he'd robbing a 7-Eleven store. And the 7-Eleven owner shot him as he left. And it stuck with me because the 7-Eleven company had just given us a bunch of coolers to transport the hearts, and I thought it was rather ironic that I was bringing him back, his heart back in a 7-Eleven cooler. And but he couldn't have been more dissimilar to this recipient, but this patient never rejected. And I think that's one of the things we really have to study is why. Not why they die. We know why they die, but we don't know why we have long-term survivors like that. These are the usual stuffs. Now, I want to focus a little bit on these pumps, and as I mentioned, there's a lot of them being implanted, and it's being widely used. I was the only clinician actually involved in it in the 80s, and I'll tell you why I got involved. These were the 2 engineers, so there was 3 of us, and this is one of the things I always usually show early on just to get you ready. But I was talking to this guy. He's an Irish singer. Not too long ago, I had dinner with him. I actually didn't know him. My daughter did. She was very excited. Very interesting guy because he was very interested in heart surgery, and he was one of the things he pointed out to me that he had this band that's been together since these guys were in high school, but none of them, only one of them ever had music lessons. He never had any. He just wrote his own tunes, and we thought and we seemed to agree that that was an advantage because he could be creative. You know, you go to school, you take tests, you're always looking backwards. You can't be creative looking backwards. And it's one of the problems, I think, in our educational system. We depend so much on you learning, taking tests and doing well on tests that have very little bearing in doing any creativity. And there's certainly no evidence-based medicine that if there's no evidence. So if you depend on the views of most of the people in academia that you deal with, you won't go anywhere. Serendipity does play a big role, and serendipity in medicine particularly has been important from the time of Jenner and the smallpox on. This is serendipity. This is Dr. DeBakey. Dr. DeBakey looks a bit like Groucho Marx. He looks like a nice, entertaining guy, but let me tell you, he was not entertaining. And anybody that says they like Dr. DeBakey, never met him, But you can't say that you didn't respect him because he worked like hell. He built this medical center. It was very important in building Baylor, which was a third-rate medical school when he came here, and by the time I went, it was considered one of the best in the South. This is our medical center. I guess you'll have seen it. There's Herman still there. Dr. DeBakey told me he went to this, was interviewed here, and he heard gunshots, and they told him they were hunting out here. They hunted out in this woods around what's now the medical center, and the largest medical center in the world, as you know. Dr. DeBakey was, of course, very well known. By the time I started the medical school, here he is with Jimmy Howell in a Life magazine in the early 60s, 62, I think. All these pumps he was working on, these various pumps from a very early stage. He initiated so much of this work. The first LVAD patient to live was this woman, who very brave young Mexican lady who had awful valve disease and would have died without this pump, and survived. And Dr. DeBakey, by the way, he took this out. He disconnected her from the pump after 10 days. He did an ICU, put some iodine on here, iodine here, put some clamps on it, oversewed it, never did anything else. I remember him saying, "Hold still, my dear, hold still." I was on his service then. Poor thing, she was moving around a little bit, you know. He was disconnecting her from this pump while she was awake. Anyway, it's a different world.
The pump is working fine. As soon as we can assure ourselves that the heart can take over the full workload, and we'll get rid of the pump.
The initial pumps were for recovery, you know, for the recovery of the heart. I just always like to show I don't think we have this anymore. It's a shame, really, you know, because Dr. DeBakey really was a character-building experience. I think we have an anger management section somewhere in our hospital that they told me about. I'm sure they want me to go there.
Back in the 1960s, Michael DeBakey was one of a handful of leading heart surgeons. He was known as the Texas Tornado.
What do you mean it's not flushing? Yeah, he cut it off. God damn it. I know, but you don't know what I want to do, you see.
Well, Dr. DeBakey was quite a taskmaster. He was, it was like working under a Marine drill sergeant. It's the patient's life that you're concerned about. And I think Dr. DeBakey always emphasized that in a manner that was very forceful.
Ever put your hand in front of my line of vision? No. Put your finger over that. So you're not concentrating, you're watching me.
This went on and on and on, never stopped.
His exacting standards brought to Texas a host of luminaries.
Beat you to
Marlene
a pulp.
Dietrich, the Shah of Iran, and the Duke of Windsor.
The Duke of Windsor was the King of England at one time.
All the medical skill of Europe available. Why did you come to Houston? Dr. DeBakey.
At an age when most people
There was an order you had to be in this
DeBakey was just embarking on the research
procedure,
which
you
would
know,
consume the
going
rest
on
of his life.
rounds. Anyway, these are things you would hear all the time throughout the case, you know. He was just always beating on you, never stopped, you know. And you heard this constantly, you know. I went in one time, I was looking for one of the the junior staff that I was doing some research with, and he was standing in the corner with his two assistants, and Dr. DeBakey was doing an aneurysm with the nurse, and he would do this every now and then. He'd get so mad at people, he'd go make them stand in the corner. So the staff guys would all be standing in the corner, and Dr. DeBakey would do the surgery with the nurse, and it just went on and on. You just couldn't believe it unless you were there. And this is one of his favorite sayings, which, of course, there's some truth to that. This is the meanest thing I ever heard him say. He said this to a guy named Dick Brunswick one time. He was a good guy, but somehow he didn't. Of course, he ended up getting fired. But I thought he was a little harsh on him here. Anyway, this is George Noon. We called George when I was a medical student. God damn it, George, because that's all Dr. DeBakey you ever heard from him. But he did start the artificial heart research.
My major goal now, as far as my research work is concerned, is to perfect the artificial heart.
And here we are, May 1965, just around the corner, huh? We're going to have an artificial heart. Well, I was a medical student then, and we all had to do research projects, and here he is again. This is one of his famous, it's a paraphrase of something other people have said, but he was a remarkable person. Anybody that says they didn't respect him and didn't appreciate him because, 3 in the morning he wasn't out on the golf course. And he was always there working. And he really taught me how to work and how to take care of the sick. He got this money from LBJ, which was unique because it was the first time the NIH ever funded any clinical research. This is Baylor when I started in medical school. This is Ben Taub. We had to walk over here. We parked right here, and we had to walk all the way over here. I think they park out here somewhere now. I'm not sure. I played football. That's all I cared about. Good Texas boy. It's the only sensible thing. And I had very little interest in anything other than literature and history. Science is particularly boring. Always be suspicious of anybody that says they like the Krebs cycle. You just try to get away from them as soon as you can and be nice, but just, It's, and by serendipity, Tillman O'Brien, I was going to be the first specialty kicker for Darrell Royal because I could kick better I wasn't fast enough quite to start, at least in my sophomore year. But I could kick. And this guy, Tillman O'Brien, who's a real gristlehead guy, a sweet guy, but he weighed about 250. And I'd kick the ball, and he hit my leg, and I heard my hamstrings pop. And that was the end of my football career. So I had to think of something. My mother always tried to emphasize to me she didn't care what I did as long as I didn't cheat, lie, or steal. That sort of limits things. I couldn't think of anything myself. Certainly didn't want to be a Methodist minister like my uncle. I didn't want to teach school like my parents. I didn't want to spend my life in somebody's mouth. So that ended up, and I was reading a lot of Chekhov then, who was a physician. It's worthwhile reading, even in translation. And so I decided to go to medical school. And as I said, we had to do a research paper. I had no interest in science particularly. So I was recruited by this friend of mine who was a fraternity brother by chance, a guy named Frank Polk. There's a section of Johns Hopkins Hospital named for Frank now for his work in AIDS. He died of a brain tumor in his 40s very tragically, but he got me involved in heart surgery. He unfortunately had an intentional tremor, so I ended up doing most of the surgery. And I worked on, this is the first total artificial heart. It was developed by Domingo Leota, and I remember Dr. DeBakey telling me this, and he really believed that. By 1980, there'd be 100,000 Americans with artificial hearts, and this was a government plan because we had $500 million total funding for this development of these work. But as you can see, or can't see, by the early 80s, we should have been in clinical work.
It's just a pump. And it seemed logical that if that's the main function, you ought to be able to duplicate that mechanically.
Well, it did seem logical. Didn't seem hard. Dr. Cooley came here later. Dr. DeBakey came in 50. Dr. Cooley came in 51, actually. 49. Dr. DeBakey's first year was 49. Here's Dr. Cooley with Blaylock, and that's Albert Starr, this little Weasley guy back here, and who developed the first valve that actually worked. And he's still alive, actually. Both of them still alive. But the man who really developed heart surgery was Lillehei. And Lillehei did cross circulation. That was the first successful heart surgery, was cross circulation. That is using the parent as the heart-lung machine, if you will. And he was the first one to get people through. And Dr. Cooley went up to visit Lillahai in the fall of 1955. Cooley had been with Blaylock, and he did the Blaylock-Towsing, so he was the only one that had any heart surgery experience. He went up there with the pediatric cardiologist, who was a real hard-shell Baptist, nice guy, but a hard-shell Baptist, if you know what I mean. And they met Lillahai, and Lillahai took him out to dinner, but they went to a roadhouse instead of going to a nice restaurant like you normally do when you're a visiting professor. They went to a roadhouse out on the edge of Minneapolis, and had all the dancing girls there drinking, and of course the pediatric cardiologist immediately left. You don't want to be around all these sinful people. And of course Cooley had a great time. He was drinking and laughing, and Lillahai, all the girls knew him, and Cooley told me, he said, well, about midnight, Lillahai comes over to him and says, you know, Den, can you get a cab to get you back? Looks like I'm going to be tied up with one of these flu. Cooley said he left with this, sleazy-looking girl. But so anyway, he got it back, and in the morning he wakes up at 8 o'clock. He's going to go do the heart surgery, and the surgery's supposed to start at 8. And Cooley's hungover. The hotel is on the University of Minnesota campus. It's still there, I think. And he throws something on. He runs over to the hospital, and of course the mother's asleep, the baby's asleep. The pediatric cardiologist is just disgusted with him. You know, he's there, just can't believe it, but they're waiting for Lillahai. There's no Lillahai. So I wonder how this would happen today in your hospital. Lillahai didn't show up, and they got to about 9 o'clock, and he finally shows up. He's all hungover. He goes out by the sink and he starts spouting water in his face, to sort of wake up. And then the nurse breaks some amyl nitrate under him, like they used to do for boxers. And then Cooley said he came down and he hooked him up, and he closed a VSD, which Cooley had never seen done. And he says the most beautiful surgery he'd ever seen. And from that time on, he became obsessed with the idea of heart surgery. And anyone in that era will say that Lillahai was the most important early person in surgery. He eventually lost his license. There's a book called King of Hearts. It's worth, all of you should read it that are involved in any way in cardiac disease. It's a great, well-written book, and it shows the serendipity, again, that you go through. But this is something people forget. Gibbon had a survivor. First case he did survived. Second case he did survive. The next 3 died. He never did another case. And of the first 20 cases, Lillahai wrote this up. There was only one survivor. And Lillahai, I'm sorry, the slide's a bit out of place. Wait a minute. Anyway. Cooley came back, and he performed the first heart surgery here at Methodist Hospital in April of 1956. And Lillahai always said, he said at public meetings, he said it to me, I got to know him very well because he lost his license when he was in his early 50s, but would still go to all the meetings. And he thought the most important person in heart surgery was Cooley. Cooley made his first heart-lung machine. He went to a restaurant supply house. This is a coffee machine. They use it to make coffee. He had a friend that knew some people in the restaurant supply house. And he went over and he got steel wool to filter the oxygen out. And he hooked it up with his finger pump. And he did the first open heart case with this stuff. He bought it, off the street. I mean, you'd go to jail today, of course, if you did that today. And this was a case he did, a ruptured VSD after an infarct, a bad case to do today, and the guy lived. And this was the reason Lillahai thought Cooley was the best heart surgeon in the world. he could do this surgery. The reason people died is they couldn't be on that bubble oxygenator that long, and Cooley could get it done. You can see the very short pump times. By 1956, he'd done more heart surgery than anybody in the world. And he continued to do that until 1994. This is just a few visitors. They're only supposed to have 3 visitors in the St. Luke's, and they never really complied with that. I don't want to spend too much time on heart transplants other than to say the first era was unsuccessful. Dr. Cooley,
for Carp were slim,
however, did
Cooley
the first
went where
total
no
artificial
surgeon had
heart.
gone before.
And this
Working
was
without the approval of either his hospital or the government, he removed the 2
Dr.
lower
DeBakey.
chambers of Carp's heart and replaced them with an 8-ounce plastic artificial heart that had never been tested in humans.
This was strictly an emergency situation, and that's been my purpose all along, was to save Mr. Carp's life.
sort of stupid. I mean, it's the first time it'd be tested in human. You know, if you're going to test it in human, it would be the first time. It's sort of a ridiculous statement. But this did result in a separation of Dr. Cooley and Dr. DeBakey. And here's the x-ray of that first patient. The first patient did great. They mismanaged his immune suppression, way over immune suppressed him. His white count was 2,000 when they actually did the transplant, and he died
Well, in
of
those days, I didn't
overwhelming
feel like I needed
sepsis.
permission. I needed the patient's consent. That was essential, of course. And I think if I had sought permission from, say, the federal agency or the hospital or something, anybody else, I think I probably would have been denied, and we'd have lost a golden opportunity. I was in Washington when I read in the morning papers
Dr. DeBakey never took
about
this well.
the use of this artificial heart that Dr. Cooley had put in a patient. I was shocked. I didn't know that he had done all of this
Serendipitously. Anyway.
Now, Dr. Cooley had no experience with the artificial heart program at all. Didn't
That
do
was
any
true.
laboratory work. He was a good surgeon, but that's all.
He was a good surgeon, but
Dr.
that's all.
DeBakey.
Anyway, he never quite recovered from all that. But, and the heart transplants didn't work out very well. I was in Vietnam at the time in the 48th Assault Helicopter Company. It was a constant combat unit, eventually destroyed in Laos. It just, I was in a little better shape then. My daughter doesn't believe that's me. She thinks but it was a little different world. I don't know of anybody that had the bad luck, I guess, or, in some ways. Good luck in others, because it gave me a lot of perspective on life and the world, dealing with an active combat company and having breakfast with a guy and seeing him dead 4 hours later has an effect on you. That's the only guy in the medical corps that got on the sheet of air medal recipients, you'll see, is Frazier. Anyway. But one of the things I learned there that you really had to have people with a lot of courage. One of our most courageous guys was a guy named Dallas Harper. He was a very brave pilot, young, skinny kid from Alabama, but totally fearless. And I remember I was flying with him my commander one time, and he said, Dallas, you got to go in and pick up these LRRPs. The LRRPs are long-range research reconnaissance. And that's one of the things we did. And he said, they're on the side of a hill, though, Dallas, and they're taking fire. And there's a lot of rocks there, so you got to be careful. So 3 things that are the worst things that can happen to you: side of a hill, hard for a helicopter to hover, rocks. You know, you hit a rock with your propeller, you're dead, and they're taking fire. And Dallas said, "Oh, I got it. They're on the side of a hill. They're taking fire, and there's a lot of rocks there." He said, "Yeah, get in there, Dallas. You got to get them right now."
Excuse me while I kiss the sky.
Anyway, that was what Dallas said. Excuse me while I kiss the sky. And my commander, I remember saying, what the hell did he say? What did he mean by that? And I said, he meant he would do it. And he did. He went in and got those guys out. Anyway, I did my cardiac training with Dr. Cooley. This is most cases we did in one day, actually. This was 1982. These were all in one place, one day. These are the cases that Cooley did. All tough cases. Nobody can do this anymore. Nobody can, there's not a person alive can do this schedule. And and I was there, and I don't know how he did it. I mean, these are tough cases, all of them.
Start off in this Hatfield here.
So after he talked to all the families how, as a group after the
I
surgery.
explored him. It looked like all the bleeding was coming from this area. His valve, we resected, we took out a piece maybe 4 or 5 feet long. And we'd sent that over the
So he
laboratory.
talked to each patient. If there was a death, there was a lot of deaths, but he took the family into side room.
Very difficult operation, but we did the 3 bypasses. We repaired the mitral.
3 bypasses, repaired the mitral.
Well, we did one was a very small vessel, and so it was not necessary. We did the 3 main ones, 3 big ones. And then did the valve, and then we took out his gallbladder. His gallbladder was very bad.
Always took out the
Gallstones and all
So,
shrunken
you
and
know,
scarred.
that
and
was
so
a
on.
typical case. Anyway, so as I say, it's a different world. And this is a book worthwhile reading too if you're going to be in heart surgery. And but because the heart transplants failed in the early days, that's when they started spending all this money on these implantable pumps. And the implantable pumps were not designed as a bridge to transplant in the 70s. They were designed as a long-term pump. The contribution I made to it is one of the things they were about to give up on these pumps because the inlet cannula would obstruct. And I remembered that Dr. DeBakey taught me one time that about inlet cannulas and obstructions. It stuck with me, you know, because we didn't have attention deficit syndrome when I was growing up. I don't know. This is I get nervous even looking at her. I don't like to look at her. That was my English teacher when I was in the 7th grade. If you even spoke in her room, you got a ruler in your hand. So we didn't have attention deficit, and you didn't have it with Dr. DeBakey either. And I remember going to see one patient, Mr. Kaplan, who kept occluding his fempop. And he probably had a heparin antibody we didn't know about at the time. And Dr. DeBakey had operated on 4 times, and he kept occluding. I was an intern. Nurse calls me in the middle of the night, you know, Kaplan's leg is cold. And so I went to see Dr. DeBakey, and of course, he never wore a beeper, but I knew, you always knew where he was. I asked him if he would come see Mr. Kaplan, and I was worried about him. If I'd have told him that Kaplan's graft had occluded again, he would have fired me. So you couldn't say things like that. I knew that. And but I took him up there, and of course, it had occluded, and you never ask him a question. That's the other thing. It's just you really had to be stupid to ask him a question because he didn't want to hear anything from you, nothing. And but I was so tired. I'd been up all night the night before. I said, I wonder why the graft occludes, and he heard me, and he called me outside, just going to the woodshed, you know, just the 2 of us, and the nurse, just in the middle of that. He said, do you understand Virchow's triad? Is that too hard? Is that too hard for your pea brain? Virchow's triad. Do you understand that? You know, yes, sir, I understand. Yes, sir. Well, then you should know that when blood starts moving, it clots. Now, is that too hard for you? That's not too hard for you. But it always stuck with me, you know. He had a way of teaching you that it stuck with you. So when this graft kept occluding, I told this guy who was a Harvard Phi Beta Kappa AOA from Harvard that was running the project, I said, look, you got to get rid of that inlet cannula because the blood's stopping during systole when the pump's pumping, and it pumps 100,000 times over 24 hours. It's going to occlude, so he got rid of it. And that became the first approved pump by the FDA. And if we hadn't have done that, we would have never even had the field, I don't think, today, because this was the only really good pump. And this was one of the first patients that had the implantable form of the pump. I implanted it in '91. It took 30 years to get the pulsal pumps, though, done. And I'm going to run through this. As I said, one of the problems, the rematch was a very interesting trial. There's Jarvik, and I worked with Jarvik a lot, and Shumway, I worked with him a lot. I got to know Shumway very well. And but Shumway pointed out to me that this 2-year pump didn't make any epidemiologic significance. Because if you just had a 2-year pump, it'll just be people added to the transplant list. And you already had too many people to transplant list. And that's what, he said, but that's a nightmare. You're just going to cause a nightmare. And that's actually why I started working on continuous flow pumps. These pumps were good. They kept people alive. They were life-saving, but they were too big, and they wore out 100,000 times every 24 hours. It's amazing they lasted as long as they did. We had 2-year pumps, but that's it. And there are still 7,000 patients awaiting heart transplant. So you have to have a continuous flow pump. And I started working and discussing this and doing research with the Biomedicus pump in the early 80s. And, of course, there was a lot of people who opposed it, said it couldn't possibly work. You had to have a pulse, et cetera, et cetera. It is required in mammalian physiology. But if you think about it, the only organ that really needs a pulse is the heart itself for diastole, not for systole. And at the capillary level, it's always continuous flow. With Rich Wamper, we developed a pump called the hemopump that was based on an Archimedes screw, and it's now used. It's called the impeller, which is a bad hemopump, but it's the only one we've got, so we have to use it. This boy was the first patient I had that had he had a stone heart, and yet with just a continuous flow pump, he was awake, eating his popsicle, and lived without any sort of pulse. And again, that clinical experience showed me that you could live without a pulse, and that you would have this high RPM pump, 25,000 RPM, without destroying the blood. And we also, Jarvik made these bearings work, and that's what made the implantable pumps possible. So the hemopump showed that you could have these high RPM, and Jarvik made these pumps, these lubricated or non-lubricated bearings, because every bearing in every mechanical situation you have requires oil. You have oil in your car because of the bearings. So you just have to trust that. With the first patient we did, I actually did him in Oxford in June of 2000. This guy lived 7.5 years with a continuous flow pump. Pump was worked like perfect when we took it out. It had no bearing wear. And he actually died of a nosebleed because he was over anticoagulated, which most of these patients are always over anticoagulated now. And incredibly, he was my age, but I was really embarrassed by this guy because he had 2 girlfriends. 2 young women came when he was dying from his nosebleed, and they both showed up at the same time. They both got mad at him, typical deal, you know. And they refused to agree to a blood transfusion, so you've got to be careful with these things. But and certainly you didn't want them both showing up at the same time. Anyway, so this was no bearing wear, huh? It's great. Jarvik still has the best pump, probably. It has very few infections. unfortunately, it's Jarvik. You've got to deal with Jarvik, who's difficult at best. But the other pump is this HeartMate 2, which is a knockoff of the Jarvik that we worked on after the guys at Pittsburgh had sort of screwed it up. They put it in 10 Germans, 9 of them died. They were making a basic mistake. You can make the most fundamental mistake in this. They put this centered titanium, which caused the pump to occlude. Anyway, this is, of course, patients now can do anything they want to with these pumps. This is a young man. He was 25 when we did him. He was 35. He was 30 years old. He had it for 5 years. We took it out. He's 2 years out now. He doesn't have anything. That's going to be a big use for the cardiologist. There's been over 300 of these things put in Kazakhstan. And there have been over 100 patients with pumps in for over 8 years. There's one patient that's had the same pump in for 12 years, and the pumps haven't failed. So I think the centrifugal force pumps work the same way, but I think the main thing I want to touch base is a total heart, because I started working on the total heart in 2005. Because I figured that that's the only way we're going to make a total heart that'll work. And some patients need a total heart replacement. This is one of the early calves we did, and we showed it was feasible. I remember talking to Dr. DeBakey about this when he was very excited about it. He was 96 years old when I was talking to him, and when he said, 5 to 10 years we'll have this in patients, Bud, He was 96 years old. I didn't say anything. He looked at me. He knew what I was thinking, and he said, well, of course, Bud, we hope you'll still be with us then. And tragically, he didn't, because I think he would have really been pleased with this work. Now we put these pumps in patients, but right now the last thing I want to show you is this total heart, because you're all going to see this work. This will work. This is a total heart that'll work. This total heart that I worked on for years didn't work. It was a good heart, but it was a pulsatile pump again, and it didn't work. This is a young Australian engineer has developed this pump, has one moving part. It's suspended by a magnet, magnetically suspended. It has a actual response like a starting to response. You can put the calf on a treadmill, and without changing the pump, the cardiac output will go up as much as 5 liters. This is designed to be totally implantable. We just had a calf that went 100 days, which none have ever done before with these pumps. And it gained weight because it'll pump 20 liters. The old pumps the pulsatile pumps, we could never get one pump with more than 6 or 7.5 liters. See, it just has this one moving part, incredibly. And one is pumping to the pulmonary circulation, the other's pumping to the arterial, the lower one, and it works beautifully. And I hope we'll have this in patients. I can't see why we wouldn't have it within 2 years. I asked this guy how the pump, how it actually has a Starling's response, and what happens if the venous return comes up, this moves a bit, and if it moves, then it will pump more on the systemic side. So it has a Starling's response. And I always remember when I came back from Vietnam, my grandfather was one of the first organic chemistry teachers in Texas, brilliant guy. He taught at A&M for 40 years and lived forever. He was born in 1874. And I went by to see him, this was 1970, and I asked him what he thought about going to the moon. And he said, I don't think they went to the moon, And I said, come on, Granddaddy, of course they went to the moon. He said, no, they faked it somehow. I said, they can't fake going to the moon. I don't want to even hear you say that. He said, well, maybe they did go to the moon. But remember, I drove mules to Oklahoma in the land rush, which he did in 1890. And I can't describe to you the astonishment I had when I saw the first airplane fly over. And I volunteered for World War I, but I was too old. Maybe they did go to the moon, but I just don't want to think about it. So I remember asking this engineer, how does it know? I mean, how does it position itself? It says, well, it has 96,000, it has 26,000 data points a second, and the data points tell it exactly where it should be relative to the pressure. So wait a minute, 26,000 data points a day or a week? Or he said, no, Dr. Frazier, 26,000 a second. So I immediately thought of my grandfather. Maybe it is 26,000 a second, but I just don't want to think about it, you know. That's just too much. Anyway, it's great technology. This you can create, by the way, I'm sorry, you can create a pulse. You can create a pulse with these things just by changing this RPM. This is a pulse with it. I don't think you need a pulse, but you can. You know, that's not true. I think you do need a pulse, but maybe 2 or 3 a minute, but not 70. But you can do anything you want to with these calves and do anything with this pump that you want to. So I think
we should be able to develop a pump, a mechanical pump, that will substitute for the heart. So I'm convinced this can be done.
And it will be done, and I'm sure y'all will live to see it, and I hope I will live to see it. Thank you very much.